Okay. So welcome to the final installment. You have braved it through 4 of the 5 sessions that were initially designed to be 3, but we got through to 5, and I imagine if I had more mercy on all of us, we would have made this 7 or 8 and not have gone so long in the previous occasions. It is my aim to finish on time this evening. I don't know what that time is, but it's going to be prompt and not too late. Having said that, as I was going over the slides this morning to prepare for this evening, it struck me that there were some gaping holes that we needed a plug. So I had to add some extra material, but I'm going to try to move swiftly. We're not going to read everything inside. I want to respect your time and give you a night to sleep. But as it's our last occasion on this series, I'd like to just very briefly do an overview of where we're up to now, what we've done so far. And then we'll burst into our subject for this evening and rack up all the options, the opinions, see if we can reflect on what it means for Jewish life. And then we will wrap up. So let's begin. There were 3 major areas we were going to explore. Number 1, agency. Number 2, Shabbat, labor. And number 3 was simulation. And when it came to agency, we began with a general introduction to the history of electricity, how amber was always known to possess some unique characteristics and traits, and Greek myth birthed ideas about how amber got to be unique in terms of its capacity to hold static electric charge. We looked at how electricity through Faraday and then Edison came to be used more broadly in everyday life, how that impacted the Supreme Court and decisions in secular courts, and how that started to touch on Jewish life. First question was agency. If I press a button, is it me performing the act? And we essentially went through 3 texts in the Talmud, 3 rabbinic texts, one which involved throwing a knife to kill a cow, one of which involved opening a watermill to kill a cow or a friend if you're not getting on so well. And the third option was pulling the shield away from somebody who had just been fired at. And the question was, in electricity, is it the equivalent of throwing a knife, in which case it is you, without a doubt? Is it like opening a mill, in which case it's somewhat ambiguous because you did cause it to run through, but it can't be seen as your momentum? Or is it like moving a shield, in which case you have nothing to do with the flow of the arrow or flow of electricity? We had essentially 2 views. Nobody thought it was like throwing a knife. Electric current is not you moving. But there was ambiguity about whether it's seen as you letting it start or you just getting out the way. And we basically fell into the position where we presume electrical agency, at least the first burst of electricity, is you. So you would be liable and you are considered an agent. It is considered your agent as far as responsibility goes. We discussed that in the context of matzah and tzitzit and tefillin and sefer Torah, which we determined that if an object, and we'll come back to this in today's subject, if an object requires the investment of sanctity, it involves kedusha, like tefillin, or a sefer Torah. Now, tzitzit's interesting because it's a davar mitzvah, but it's not a davar kedusha. It doesn't quite have sanctity in the same way, but it's used for ritual. And the big difference with this is, if tefillin ends up becoming pasul, what do you have to do with it?
Put it on there.
What do you do with a piece of parchment from tefillin if it becomes pasul?
You have to bury it.
You have to bury it. It's got sanctity. You can't just throw it out. Tzitzit becomes pasul. What do you have to do with it?
Put it on a 3-year-old.
Say again?
Put it on a 3-year-old.
You can put it on a 3-year-old. So it's interesting.
Put it in a
But you bury the tits, not the beged.
Put it in a bag and throw it out.
So essentially, as Jerry says, we don't have to bury it. It loses its utility as a davar mitzvah, but as sensitive Jews, we do all we can to make sure it's okay, which means we try to bury it, we try to treat it with respect. A lot of people will use tzitzit as a bookmark to make sure it maintains the purpose. It's essentially the same as a lulav. A lulav is a davar mitzvah. You use it for a mitzvah. After Sukkot is over, what do you do with your etrog?
Pickle.
You make jam out of it.
Make jam out of it, or you do something with it, you could throw it out. It doesn't really maintain sanctity. But anything with Jewish text, any with Hebrew language, biblical language, rabbinic language, it's invested with sanctity. And this comes back to a principle of Jewish life generally, where we live, we are the people of the book. It's not just a turn of phrase, but text is the root of sanctity. And it requires human agency. Even if we believe that electricity can work on our behalf, the human hand has a unique capacity to invest sanctity, and you can't have a robotic arm write a Sefer Torah, even if you're sitting there pressing the button. So that was agency. That was number one. Then we came to the question of labor on Shabbat, and we had two sections. We had the first responders who essentially were trying to figure out which malacha it is. We had guesses that maybe it was Ma'avir, which is Aish. You had a fire going on in the current, that was dismissed. There was a suggestion that maybe it's Bona because you're building the current every time you close the switch. That was held onto out of a sense of deference to the Chazon Ish by a number of people, but essentially dismissed as a compelling argument. And then we had someone suggest maybe it's Moled, a rabbinic prohibition to birth new states on Shabbos, like ice melting. So maybe if you start an electric current, something new is happening. Again, technically speaking, it's the same as opening a faucet of water. You haven't You've not injected anything new into wires. There, it's just started moving. But then we settled in the first responder section on tradition, on the fiddler on the roof argument. We got to keep it because that's what the Jewish people have decided. And if the Jewish people universally have decided we don't use electricity, you can start playing about with what the problem is, but you can't start overruling and deciding it's not a problem. That was first responders. Then we came to the second section, post-2016. Rav Nachum Rabinovich suggested that Jewish life, not Jewish life, human life has changed in fundamental ways so much that actually it deserves revisiting this issue. Because if we don't revisit the issue, it's not like we're uprooting tradition. The tradition is no longer really in force because life has altered in such radical ways. Like we said, you go to a hotel, you can't go to the bathroom without being near an electric sensor, either with the toilet or hand washing. You can't get into a building without setting off a door sensor. And progressively over time, life is going to change in that direction where everything is electrified. You're going to walk down the street and set off 15 things just to move down the street. So, you know, if it starts to be that traffic lights are not just on a timer, but pick up whether pedestrians are around, we're not going to be able to walk outside on Shabbos. So what do? We can have Jewish neighborhoods without traffic lights. So Rav Rabinovich suggested, let's revisit this issue and start thinking about not which malacha we can pin electricity on, but the places in which actually automated electric objects can facilitate better observance of Shabbat. And if it makes Shabbat more meaningful, and legally it's not a problem, maybe we need to start breaking new ground and allowing some things. That was him. Of course, there was a vociferous response from almost everybody else. When I say almost everybody else, I mean everybody else on the matter. We had Rav Ariel representing a school of those who said, Tevi is still on the roof, stop shaking. We've got tradition, Jewish tradition is important, and if we're not Nevi'im, we're B'nai Nevi'im, we are the children of prophets, and we had this instinct. For whatever reason, everyone's trying to figure out what's wrong with electricity, and it's not, he claims, Jewish instinct to try to prohibit everything. One might disagree with that. There may be a humorous joke about that not being the case, but Jewish decisors don't try to find ways to prohibit everything. And if everybody was looking for what's wrong with electricity, there was an instinct that it was going to ruin Shabbat, and we need to hold on to that instinct and prohibit it. That was Rav Ariel. And we had Rav Asher Weiss, who said, I agree culturally, I need some legal padding. And he suggested that actually there is a biblical malacha with electricity, makeh b'patish, because it is a novel innovation, and that changes the way we experience life and Shabbat, and really it should be biblically prohibited. We had some fallout along those lines. Then we, last week, finished off the discussion of electricity on Shabbat with the question of Alexa and Google Phone, which I'm not going to say too loudly in case it sets my phone off, about asking, what's it called? Voice activated electrical appliances. Oh, I guess we'll turn the page because we're doing the outline. Voice activated electric implements what's the rule with that? And we suggested that really it's problematic on Shabbat because speaking, though in and of itself is not deemed an act, the prohibition on Shabbat is not speaking. The prohibition is the act. And if speaking is just the means to achieve an act, it's a problem. Bottom line, as it stands, Section 2, creative labor, we determined that consensus right now is that electricity on Shabbat is prohibited rabbinically, which means there are certain allowances. If somebody's sick, not pikuach nefesh, in which case you can overrule biblical law, but if somebody is sick, they need to lie down, they're in pain, there may be some things you can do with a shinui, even though it's electrical, to make sure that they are made more comfortable or you are making them feel better or aid them in their healing. So we said kavod habriot can override rabbinic problems, and if electricity is just, I don't mean to say just flippantly, but if it is on a rabbinic strata of prohibition, maybe kavod habriot can overrule it on Shabbat too. How we define that is up for grabs and up for a question. Either way, that was section 1, section 2. And last week we began the question of simulation. And we asked, beginning with the trailer of the Netflix Yule logs, whether electric light or screens and images and videos can simulate flames or daylight. And we looked at Shabbat candles, Havdalah candles, Hanukkah candles, B'dika Chametz candle, Yortzeit candles, Ner Tamid in the shul, and we suggested with each of them a different response because it's not monolithic. Some of those candles are designed to provide light in the house. Some of those are designed to give honor to those who have passed. Some of those to commemorate historical events. So each one had their own response as to whether electric light or visual images of fires could replace it, and we dealt with those one at a time. We then turned to the second part, which we finished last week, which was daylight. And we looked at Hilchot Nida and the rule of starting court cases during the day and whether having illumination, though electric and artificial, could compensate for those things. And we didn't necessarily reach a bottom line on all of them, but we touched on those issues to make us think. Now, we pivot to what in my mind was the final area. And I had to supplement towards the end, we'll turn to that. But we now turn to what is on your screen in blue and red and white for Independence Day, connection. Can electricity simulate connection? And now we're going to have to explore when in Jewish life is there an obligation for us to be connected to something else? And this is a simulated virtual world, and this is essentially the outline, the overview of what we're going to look at piece by piece as briefly but reasonably as we can. The first thing is publicity. There are times at which in Jewish life you need to make something public. Usually we imagine public means in front of other people. So do you need to be in front of people to make something public? We'll look at examples of that. The second thing we're going to look at is evidence. Can video footage, can audio recordings function as evidence in Jewish court? Can it in secular court? That's something to think about. Can it in Jewish court, or do we need witnesses only in court? Number 3, representation. When you go to court in Jewish law, there is an obligation that the litigants appear in court. Is that always the case, or can you have a Zoom uplink? Number 4, reaction. There are things in Jewish life which we have a religious obligation to react to. Any examples?
Saying Amen.
Saying Amen. Okay, interesting. So we're going to come to the liturgy in a moment. There are things, if you see a king, what do you have to do?
Make a bracha.
Excellent. I thought you were going to say run away. Because in Jewish history, that usually is the correct response. But there's also a bracha. So what happens if I see the king on television? Do I say, I'm looking at him. I can hear them speaking. Do I say bracha? We'll talk about that in a moment. Number 5, attention. There are times at which we have an obligation to pay attention to people. That could be going to a house of mourning. That could be visiting the sick. Can we fulfill those obligations through Zoom? Number 6, friendship. And we're going to talk about this in more detail when we get there, but there are ways in which religiously we are obligated to express friendship. Can we do that virtually, as we are all right this moment? So we'll talk about that. And number 7, we're going to talk about presence, which really involves prayer as well, which will be the question of minyan. Now, having said all of that, what strikes me is that in each of these cases, whether it is making it public on Zoom or giving evidence on video or being in court through Skype or reacting to a king on your screen or visiting the sick or a house of mourning on your phone, all these cases, there is some version of seeing. If I ask you right now, can you see me? What are you going to say?
Yes.
Yeah. Instinctively, you can see my face, at least probably in the corner or somewhere on your screen. If I say, can you see me? You're going to say yes. At the beginning, I said, can you hear me? And somebody said yes. So you say you can see me. You say you can hear me. If I said, am I with you? That's a little more ambiguous because I'm not really with you, but in some sense, I am occupying, we are in each other's presence, right? I'm on your screen, I'm in your peripheral vision, I'm taking up a very small measure of space in your home and your conscience, so I am with you. So the question now comes, in Jewish life, when there are obligations to see things or hear things or be in the presence of things, can that be simulated? Are you hearing me halachically right now, or is this just a figment of technological imagination that halachically has no weight? That's going to be our question in all these cases. So let's turn to the first case, and we're going to run through this. TBD, number 8. That's the stuff I had to supplement. We'll come to that. Now, the first thing, publicity. Why do I have pots and pans on my screen?
Making things hefker before Pesach.
Perfect. This is something I would never in my life have thought of until the COVID crisis in the lead up to Pesach. People bought new objects. They wanted to take them to the Keli mikveh. The Keli mikveh closed. What are you meant to do? And for the first time, we really had to publicly enact what had been privately dispensated to people in extenuating circumstances, that just publicly say that it's no longer yours, make it hefker. And Rav Shechter dealt with it here in his Shalut Tshuva, which is called, I think it's called Shut Corona. You can find it all on the YU website. And he says, when it comes to kelim, misha mafached lalechet lemikveh, someone who's scared to go to the mikveh. Now, if you're looking at this out of the blue, in 2049, you look back to these tshuvot, you're thinking, oh, it must have been a crazy time for Jews. They were scared to go to the mikveh. But of course, we're living in a time which is, thank God, pretty good for Jews in New York. But we're living in such extenuating human circumstances that people were terrified. Not only terrified, it was closed. What are you going to do? You can give it to a non-Jew as a gift. Now, I had to make a decision when I was publicizing our policy. There were different suggestions given. One was to give it to a non-Jew with a gift. One was to sell it to non-Jews like we sell chametz. My sense was I didn't want to make it overly complicated. Those who did sell to non-Jews, there are now people who are saying, well, the mikveh's open, how do I buy it back? And they're having to do these weird kind of timed resales, which not everybody can be there for, so it's a little complicated. So we essentially settled on this. You bought it in a store, it's yours, but you decide it's no longer mine. But we can't get together with other people. How do you make it hefka? Umistavra, he said, the sagi b'shomim shlosha derech ha Internet. As long as people hear it over the internet, you can send emails. Veloba inan shupafan of mamash. You don't really need presence. So that's an answer to the question. Simulated presence is enough for publicity, because what is the end? The end is that people know. I don't have to be there. They just have to know. So that was one issue of publicity. A second issue came up. Somebody comes back from the hospital after COVID, or somebody comes off a plane from traveling in the midst of the crisis. They want to say the bracha of Hagomel. How many people do you need to say the bracha of Hagomel?
10.
Usually we say you need 10. So often if somebody's given birth and they want to say Hagomel after surviving the ordeal, they come to shul and they say to the rabbi or the gabbai, can I please say Hagomel? And usually we say it around Torah reading because there's a minyan around. But you can't get a minyan in a room. So what do you do? So Rav Shechter addressed this as well. And he says, Yesh levarech derech, you can make the bracha derech
Zoom.
Zoom. You can say the bracha on Zoom with 10 people for two reasons. Chada, number one, the al pi pshuto, because really, ein hatzarach la'asara b'toret davar shebekdusha. You don't need 10 because you need a minyan. You need 10 people for Kaddish and you need 10 people for Kedusha because it is a davar shebekdusha, which we'll come to towards the end. That's not why you need 10 people for Zoom, for Hagomel. Why do you need 10 people for Hagomel? B'toret persume nisa, because you're publicizing the nace, and to publicize all you need v'hodaya barabim, to thank God in public and have a lot of people. He then finishes and says, and also it's not really compelling that you need 10, so that's in doubt, so don't worry about it at all. I should point out separately, there is one other time that I'm aware of, there may be more, where in Jewish life you need 10 people, but it's not for a minyan. 10 people for Pesume Nissa. Anyone know what I might be talking about? When in Jewish life, if I said Pesume Nissa in a vacuum, what do you think I'm talking about?
Megillah.
Hanukkah.
Okay, those are both good answers. So Hanukkah is what I'm thinking of. And when I was in Chicago, we had Mincha and Ma'ariv through the year. So when it was at 4:20, we had Mincha and Shul. Hanukkah is usually quite early. A lot of people are at work. And where I lived in Chicago, there were like 15 shuls in the space of a mile. So all the shuls had a 4:15 mincha, and all of them are standing there with 8 people hanging out the door trying to get a minyan. Wasn't that well coordinated? But there were nights on which you'd struggle to get a minyan. You got the Chanukiah sitting there waiting to light. But it turns out that if you have 10 Jews in the room, you can light the Hanukkah candles in shul with a bracha. And I said 10 Jews very specifically. What did I not say? 10
Men.
men. Because you need 10 people for Pesume Nissa, not for a minyan. So if you have 10 Jews, men and women together, you can light in shul, even if you then can't take Kaddish for Mincha and for Ma'ariv. So that's just an aside. That wasn't part of the supplementary material I intended, forgive me. But there are times in which 10 people is the mark of publicity, even when it doesn't talk about a minyan. And he suggested Gomer was the same issue. Okay, we've done issue number 1, publicity. Do you need physical sight? Do you need physical presence, or can virtual sight compensate?
Virtual. Can compensate.
We suggested
We just said that.
when it comes to publicity, we suggested simulation of technology is good. Okay, next issue. Anybody can guess what this is about just from the screen. I will give you a special prize. Yeah, I gave you too long. We'll find out.
It's a camera. It's a camera. Let's say a thermal camera.
It's a camera looking at. It's a camera looking at cows.
Cows.
On Earth. Say again. Why would you have a camera looking at cows in Jewish life?
Paraduma.
Paraduma.
Okay, that's a cow in Jewish life. What else do many of us do every morning when we have breakfast?
Have milk.
You might have some milk. So there is a question here. In terms of Israel, you need someone to watch. What if you've got a camera there? Okay, do you need physical original sight, or can you simulate that vision? That's going to be and when it comes to evidence, that question, Rabbi J. David Blythe asks it wonderfully in his survey of recent halachic periodical literature, and he puts it as follows, and I'm going to read this bit. We're not going to read everything inside, but he asks all the central questions when it comes to, can you simulate sight and presence when it comes to evidence? The availability of this technology poses intriguing questions concerning halachic cognizance of facts ascertained by means of video surveillance. Okay, here are the questions. Number 1, are images of sexual acts recorded on videotape dispositive proof of adultery? If there's adultery, there are consequences in Jewish law. Can a videotape be used in a bet din? Can a bet din impose capital punishment on the basis of testimony of witnesses to an act they observed over a video monitor? You've got security guards. 2 Jewish security guards sitting in a booth. They see somebody hurt somebody, steal something on a monitor. Can their testimony be used to convict those criminals? Or can you say, I'm sorry, witnesses need to see it with their own eyes? There's a discussion of this, which we'll come to in a moment. Well, what if they see it through a telescope, right? Is that considered original sight, or is that simulated? That's artificial. That's no different to a screen or a camera, at which point you could then go even further back and say, what about these two things? Does that simulate my vision? Am I a kosher witness to anything? So he asked that question. Another question, is the presence of a video monitor tantamount to the presence of a third party serving to render seclusion with the person of the opposite gender halachically permissible? You've got two young, a young man and a young woman, they're dating, they're in high school, they want to spend the afternoon together in the home, the parents are away. Problem of yichud, are we allowed to go into the house together? What if you've got a nanny cam or whatever they're called in the house? Does that solve the problem of yichud? He said all these questions are reasonable. Can simulated presence count halachically as real? Does either live or recorded surveillance serve to satisfy the requirements of kashrut supervision and hence constitute an acceptable substitute for the physical presence of the mashgiach or kashrut supervision? That would save the OU and the CRC and the London based in a whole bunch of money if they could just say, install this camera. We don't have to fly anybody there. We don't have to send anybody there. We can just look at the camera and it's solved. So we can't obviously answer all these questions in one seating, especially as just one branch of our discussion. But what I will note is that using video as evidence is probably something we imagine is the most natural thing in the world. Photographic evidence is used in, CSI or in Law and Order, or if you think back to the O.J. Simpson trial, all these trials, famous trials, they use video evidence. They got monitors up where they showed videos. Does it count as evidence? You have talk over the last couple months, but of course, over the last few years, about policemen, police men and women wearing, what are they called? Body cam. And whether body cam footage can be used as evidence. Of course, there are those who say, I don't care if it can be used as evidence. Guess what it can do, even if it can't be used in court?
Incite riot.
Okay, you can incite riots or launch a protest or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, but what we saw a month and a half ago is somebody took their phone, they stood on the sidewalk, and they launched a national, global riot, protest, movement, whatever you want to call it, through a simple video. So it could be that that video would have been inadmissible in court. And I guess when the case with the Detective Chauvin goes to court, they're going to have to be evidence submitted, and there may be a question about whether that video is admissible or not. It was on a phone, maybe it's not been handled properly as evidence, etc., etc. But I think it'd be hard-pressed to say that it was useless, but maybe it can't work as evidence. So we have to ask a question. And it could be that if they don't have evidence beyond that video, despite the national move, that you can't convict without evidence. That could be that that happens, in which case, of course, there'll be an uproar. But that could well be. So the question in halachic terms is, can that be used in court? All I note is, here you've got McCormick on Evidence, which I'm told reliably by Google is the highest authority on evidentiary cases in the United States. This is the 5th edition, arguing that photographs, movies, and recordings can be used, but the principle upon which, you can see in my mouth, are most commonly admitted into evidence is the same as the underlying admission of illustrative drawings, maps, and diagrams. Meaning, you can't say, I don't have a witness, I just have a video. You can have a video, but you need a witness to sit there and tell you, I know who that is, I know what that means. You need somebody to use it as an illustrative part of evidence, not as something to hang the jury with. So that's the way evidence is treated in the United States courts. There is something issued by the Department of Justice, sponsored also by the Bureau of Justice Assistance, a primer for prosecutors. If you're trying to prosecute a case and you've got video footage, you have to be very, very careful with how you store it, how you handle it, how you don't edit it. If you do edit it, how it's edited to make sure it's authenticated and it's admissible. So they've got a 15-page primer. You can Google this. I just Googled this yesterday. They've got a whole primer for how to handle and store and edit and change. And because you have to make some edits, because there are people who are caught on video who their privacy will be violated if it's displayed in public in court. So there are ways in which video footage has to be treated to be admissible. So what about putting aside capital cases? Let's look to the most mundane, I guess you might say. These are the things you can eat. Chalav, shechal vo'ata. Milk, that a non-Jew has milk, v'Yisrael ro'uhu, and a Jew saw him. What does that mean, he saw him? Can he see him on camera? Or do you have to physically be there? And this is matzlamot video, bahalacha, which was put out by Olamot, which is an organization that puts together a whole slew of sugyot in shir packets online. It's also put out in Tchumim and elsewhere. And it says, basically, it comes down to a simple distinction. B'havanat geder haberor she'Yisrael rahu. We have to figure out what that means, that a Jew has to see it. Hanidrash l'tzarech heter achalav, in order to allow the milk. Ha'im, this is the question. Dai b'yediah v'da'it. Is it enough to have certainty? Oh, shetzarech davka re'iyah, or does it have to be seen? And that's a massive distinction, because you can say that because of this camera here on your screen, I have absolute certainty that the cows were milked in a way that the milk is kosher, nothing was put in, nothing was mixed in. I have yediah v'da'it, but I don't have re'iyah. I didn't see it with my own eyes. I watched the video. And when it comes to evidence, the question is, do you need certainty or do you need human sight? And when it comes to American law, the bottom line is you need certainty. You don't need human sight. You don't need a witness to have been there at the murder. You just need to know for sure it's the case. And here he says in this compendium that the tenuva, anyone know what tenuva is?
Company.
Yeah, had the benefit of drinking milk in Israel. And if anybody can answer one of the long-held mysteries of Israeli society, why on earth they sell milk in bags, if you can figure that out for me, you can.
It's cheaper.
Oh, all right.
They used to
All right, I guess that's
sell it in Britain. In England, they had it in bags also as well. Well before you were born.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad they figured that out. Well, I guess Israel was under the British mandate. They kept that bad thing. I guess they'll have to figure that out.
It's easier to freeze that way. You can freeze it flat.
Interesting. Tell you what, it's not easy to do though. Or yeah,
Open pour.
Exactly. So, but it turns out that tenuva hamishtameshet b'machshirei video lashkacha al chaliva. Tenuva uses video. Because they rely on the possibility that when it comes to evidentiary issues, especially when we're not talking about criminal cases, we're not talking about capital cases, we're talking about evidence simply, it is enough. The fact that I know is all that I need. I don't need re'iyah. If you're going to suggest that you need re'iyah, again, if we were spending a class on questions of evidence, I would put to you, as a group, play devil's advocate and argue to me why, when it comes to evidence, you can't have simulation. You need human eyes to have seen an act. And simulation's not enough, even though I know for sure, and I've tested the authenticity, and I've got 14 witnesses who've seen the video, and I've seen the video since it was taken. It's not been meddled with. Even though I know 100% that this happened, why you would need physical eyes to have seen it initially. I would put that to you. We don't have time to delve into it. If a thought comes to mind, feel free to jump at it. But that's a question, and there are good arguments to make on that basis. What I will say, just to complete this question of evidence, which is our second section, is it is so easy in our world, especially right now, to manipulate video and manipulate photography in ways that pictures that never happen of presidents with terrorists or anything else can be manufactured overnight. Videos can be manufactured where the voice of the person in question is taken and manipulated to say things they never said, which is why I should say one has to be very skeptical. Unfortunately, one has to be very skeptical when you see videos of people doing things to think, I don't know if this is true. Again, if it's somebody playing with their grandkids, it would have to go to quite an expense to forge that. But if it's somebody who's got an agenda of one sort of another and they've got money at their disposal and they produce a video, yeah, one is reasonable to ask the question, was this forged? And I will even prove it to you, because that's the kind of person I am. I don't have a video that I forged, but I have an app on my phone. Now, this picture is on our website under our Rabbi, and you may recognize me again. It's been nearly a year, so my hair has receded a little, and we've had COVID, so I've grayed a little here along the bottom. But that is a picture of me. But you can download on your own phone something called Face app, in which you can put down any picture, and you can select different outcomes. And if you click on this picture and you put it into your phone and you ask it to age it, this is what you get.
Wow.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do with that. And when I sent it to Miriam, she nearly passed out. And I said, don't worry, that's your future. So either way, and you look at it and it's weird because it looks like me, but it's not. But it's very easy to forge these things.
Does it
and
go the other way? Can you make somebody younger?
Yeah, you can put in older faces and make them younger, but it comes out quite odd sometimes. The best way to test it is if you have a photo from you from 30 years ago, put in that and age it and see if it looks like you now. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't. But either way, I'm going to get that off the screen before we all get and now we turn to our next section, which is representation or court proceedings. And this is a question that exists both in Jewish law and in secular law and has particularly come to a head right now, which is in Jewish law, we need defendants and prosecutors to be in the courtroom for a verdict to be pronounced. You cannot have them do it from a distance. And there are two texts we're going to look at to make this point, both of which have some interesting consequences. So there's a if you have a murderer who got mixed up with others, meaning you have a murderer, you send him to the Green Mile or whatever, that's a movie, but you send them to, what's it called?
Sing Sing.
Thank you.
Rikers Island.
Alcatraz.
And you don't have video footage because this is 200 years ago. They're on death row. They're in the cells. They were all mixed up together. You mixed up the docket. You don't know which one's the defendant who's been pronounced guilty. And as a convict, you don't know which ones are awaiting the verdict. And they get mixed up. What are you going to do? Bring them all to court to pronounce the verdict? What do you do? So Kulan Pturim, the Mishnah says, none of them are put to death. So if I was on death row and a new guy comes in, they're not pronounced verdict yet, I would kind of bring him into the cell and try and mix them all up, because then you get off the hook. The Gemara says, hold on a minute. Amar Bavav Amar Shmuel, Hachabar Seshon Nigma Dina. This is only just in case you got worried that if murderers get mixed up together, none of them get killed. It's only talking about if the verdict has not been pronounced, because Ein Gomrim Dino Shal Adam Ena Bafana, verdict has to be pronounced in front of a person, and Rashi suggests, Kivan Dein Makirin Oto, since we don't know who we're talking to, Lo Havia Bafanav. That's not called in presence. I can't get 30 people, put them in the dock and say, you, whoever you are that we're talking about right now, is guilty. So you have to be present. And this is our question when it comes to, can a Zoom link work for this? Again, we're not living in an age at which the Bet Din is putting people to death. And actually, I wrote to Rabbi Reese, who's the Av Beis Din of the Chicago PRC. Again, they're not putting people to death, but I asked him the question about Zoom uplinks and whether they do have court cases through the Beis Din through Zoom. And the question here would be, in terms of Bafanav, why do we need the person to be present for the verdict? Because it could be that Zoom is simulated presence, that's enough. Why do we need them to be present? And again, we're not going to read it inside, but there's a suggestion based on the next text that we're not going to read, that it needs to be in front of them so they can respond. You need to say you are guilty when they're there so they can say, wait, before you drag me off and you put the cuffs on, I've come up with a new defense, I've got a new piece of evidence, whatever it is. And if they're sitting back in jail and the judges are sitting around the lunch table and just say, all right, guilty or not guilty, done, they don't have a chance to defend themselves. So it could be the reason is to defend themselves. And if that's the case, should Zoom work or not?
No.
Why not? Anyone disagree?
It should work.
Right, I think you could argue it either way. My sense would be that if you're on Zoom, you could probably respond, right? You hear guilty, you could say, wait, I've got a new piece of evidence, or I disagree, or whatever it is. So probably you'd say Zoom would work if that's the reason. But it could be, and again, we're not going to read it inside, but it's suggested in the name of Lichtenstein that actually this is not about the ability to technically respond. This is about human dignity, essentially. You need to be in the room when you are found guilty because you need to be in the room. You need to have the dignity of being spoken to in person if we are changing your fate. And the way, ironically, the way that this is proven is that there is one other thing in Jewish life that can be given a death sentence. Human beings can be given a death sentence. What else in Jewish life can be put to death by the court?
An ox. Ox.
Right, Shor HaNiskal. An ox who gores is sentenced to death by the court. Animals are killed all the time for food, but there is a conviction on an animal that's an ox. And the animal, according to one view, the majority view, has to be in court when the verdict is pronounced. And the dissenting view says, hold on a minute, the ox needs to be there. What? He's going to find you evidence? He's going to object to the verdict? He's going to sit there chewing grass? What are you talking about? And the assumption is that actually the dignity that we bestow on human beings, we bestow on animals there. When the fate of a being is being determined, they need to be in the room. That's the assumption on that basis. Again, we don't have a Sanhedrin doing this right now. And we don't have a bottom line as to how we would pass it, which is, again, part of our theme that yearning for a Supreme Court would address these questions. But I should say that this is an issue that has been, I guess, percolating in secular culture for a while, because there are questions about defendants turning up in court on video. And in this organization called Transform Justice, it asks the question, if it's on video, does it turn into conveyor belt justice, which violates the dignity we just spoke of, or is it a revolution in access? Suddenly, people who live out in the middle of the country don't need to fly to court. They don't need to spend a lot of money to get there. They can have a hearing from afar. And they're not the only ones who said this. In a British organization called Reformer Thoughts, delivering digital courts, they suggested a few things. Number one, it unlocks efficiency. If you have digital courts, it saves a huge amount of money, potential to save time and money, to make it easier for people to access services. I should say that one of their conclusions is a little radical, and they say, must a judge be human? Right? Meaning if you're going to court over a parking fine, and it seems pretty straightforward one way or other, what do I need to pay someone to sit there and say, yes, no, turn up, yes or no, the computer decides. And we may think that kind of takes the humanity out of a system of justice, which is a reasonable question about this issue. Now, why this video issue in court is so pertinent is precisely because of what's just happened in this crisis. Because, again, this organization called Fair Trials launched a whole effort of research and legal action because at the moment, a lot of court life has come to a standstill. We're all anticipating Supreme Court decisions that are coming out this week, came out last week and the week before. But a lot of courts that aren't dealing with urgent national issues, you try to get a parking ticket adjudicated, you're going to find it hard-pressed to find a court to go to. All sorts of things came to a halt. And for a lot of people, oh, great, so I won't pay my parking ticket. But if you've been arrested and you're waiting on bail, again, we can talk about bail reform another time, but under normal circumstances, if you're sitting waiting on bail and you can't get a hearing, you're sitting in jail for months and months and months. And while we're all, to some degree, feeling imprisoned in our homes, there are people who are physically imprisoned and can't get a hearing. So there are organizations that are trying to say, let's do digital courts, get people on video. And actually, the Supreme Court in Singapore, this I only know because I've got the BBC News app on my phone, and I get the headlines floating up when something comes up. And for the first time in history, Singapore, on about a month and a half ago, declared somebody guilty and deserving of the death penalty over Zoom. It was about a month and a half ago, and the verdict was read out by justices over Zoom to a defendant who became a convict, and he was given the death penalty. And there were all sorts of human rights groups that, while they're advocating for access, say this is horrific. How can you sentence someone to death over Zoom? And I'm not sure what the hesitation was, whether it was about dignity or whether it was they couldn't defend themselves properly, because I think Grace's instinct is also valid that really, if I'm hearing over Zoom, I might not feel that comfortable saying, wait, I've got a new argument, or wait, let me defend myself. I'm on a connection on a computer. Never mind the fact that I could lose my connection, my internet could get fuzzy, all sorts of things could happen. It seems wrong was the general human rights response to this act in Singapore, but it happened. And here's a map. I found this last week, I can't remember where, of all the places on earth that are now holding virtual courts with Zoom uplinks in the wake of what's happened. You've got England and Wales, Ireland, Scotland, France, Italy, United States, China, Australia, Spain, and more that are dealing with these issues. And the Nuffield Family Justice Observatory, don't ask me where I find these things, but Google is a useful tool, did some research into remote hearings in the family justice system. A rapid consultation. Again, COVID hit everybody out of the blue, and people had to react. Is this good? Is this not good? And what usually we would research over the course of years with control groups and analysts for over remote regions, basically we had to research instantly to see if it's good or not. And they did research not in capital cases, but in family court as to whether digital cases were helpful. And these were some of the responses they got. One magistrate said, I find it very difficult to get a proper grip on the case without seeing the parties. Body language, etc., is so important, and we're relying totally on the local authority for interpretation of what has been said. One knows very well from court that two people can hear exactly the same evidence and understand different things. So one magistrate, which is a British judge in a certain level of court, said, look, this is not great. I don't feel like I've got a proper grip on the case. I hear evidence and I need people to interpret. It's not going very well. A barrister. Anyone know what a barrister is in England?
A lawyer who appears in front of the court.
Excellent. So in England, you've got barristers and solicitors.
Solicitors
do some of the legal work behind the scenes, and barristers present in court. And this is what one barrister said. There is a real risk that the truth will not surface if we insist on proceeding remotely. And in my view, it is at real risk of being suppressed and manipulated. The inability to fully observe a party or witness, both in court and outside the courtroom. And that's amazing. He's saying sometimes you see the way a witness leaves the court, and you can figure out a way to attack a case or how to defend your client. It's also an important tool in the advocate's preparation and judicial analysis. I think by seeking to conduct contested hearings remotely, we shall undermine public confidence in a system which many are already highly critical of. So that was one response. Another one, a judge this time said, the court process is more important than simply being an administrative adjudication. It is a very human set of interactions. My role as judge is absolutely dependent on the humane administration of a very, very complex interactive process. So doing virtual courts, I'm not finding helpful. Just two more responses. Another barrister said, a huge part of the magic and value of what we family law professions do is to be in a room with a person and to listen and understand and give advice on the most human of matters, family, whilst looking at them in the eye. And this human connection is a vital part of what we do, and is not something that can be replaced with technology. Empathy is vital in areas such as family law, and an empathetic connection comes in real life, so to speak. In that room with the person is the best it can be. Practitioners are better at their job because of the technology they use, but the best work is in person, in real life, not on my computer. And I think we can sympathize with that. And the judge says here, there is no opportunity to look them in the eye to confer your own humanity, to either encourage or warn. Meaning if a judge is sitting there and a witness is testifying and they're 2 feet away and the judge looks at them when he thinks maybe they're about to tell what in England you call a porky or here you call a lie, and the judge just kind of goes, you can communicate to them a warning. Whereas if you're sitting on Zoom and they don't think you're watching or whatever, they can tell a lie and then they're penalized, or you as a judge become biased. All of which is a vital part of the initial stages of a care case. That's what the judge says. The barrister didn't like it for other reasons, etc. Now, there was one piece of positive reaction they had in the court where one respondent said, actually, there's something very good that one of my clients had, which was this. Positive feedback from parents in both cases. They found remote attendance a lot less daunting than attending court. Now, is that a good or bad thing when it comes to court?
Good.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds, I think one could argue it either way. What the argument here was, the parties are coming in a family court. I'm not familiar with the case. Presumably you have a mother and a father who are trying to figure out who's going to get jurisdiction over the children or care rights over the children. And why would you want them to be nervous just by being in the room? You want them to have their senses. You want them to feel that they can be calm. They're comfortable, they can negotiate. You don't want them to be already stressed. in theory, if one were a strict justice, you could turn and say, actually, I want people to be daunted. I want them to feel like they're in a courtroom. I want them to feel like the stakes are high. I don't want them to be in their slippers and dressing gown, holding a cup of tea, thinking to themselves, yeah, this is fine. So I guess you could argue that either way. But I just wanted to stress that this question that revolves around Jewish life is also being played out right now across the globe as to whether having virtual courts makes sense or not. Now, we move on to the next issue, which we said is reaction. There are things in Jewish life, and I know it's 9:43, I'm watching the time, we're not going to be too much longer. So in reaction, in Jewish life, there are various things you need to respond to. As we said, seeing the king. In America, you decided against that a couple hundred years ago. You don't want to have kings. But there's a question about the president. If you see a president, you have to say a bracha. Anybody here ever seen a president in the flesh, out of interest? Anyone been in the room with a president at any time?
I've been.
Hold your peace. Jackie, yes, you said?
Yes.
Yes, who?
Donald Trump.
Oh, really? When was that?
2 years ago?
Is that a Hanukkah party?
No. A private meeting?
Just you and him?
No, there were others.
I was going to say, did you record it? Oh, wow, okay. Well, there you go. You did?
No, I didn't. I wasn't allowed.
Oh, good. I wouldn't want to record that. So there is a question that's debated about it. If you see Donald Trump as it stands now, or President, whoever's in office at the time, would you say a bracha? And there are many who maintain that if you see a president of the United States, even though technically speaking, it's not a monarch, this is the embodiment of executive power in the United States. And the Queen, United Kingdom, she has a nice crown, she got a big throne, she got a bunch of palaces and a few horses, but very little executive power. And actually, maybe you should say a bracha on the President of the United States more than the Queen herself. Don't tell her I said that. But so the question becomes, for everybody on the call other than Jackie, we see Donald Trump, I imagine, quite often in the news, on our phone, on television screens, on computers, wherever it is. Presumably, we're not all saying brachas 400 times a day for that reason. So is there an obligation to say a bracha and we just don't because it's too overwhelming? Or is, when it comes to saying birchot ha'ri'iyah, brachot overseeing things, can that not be simulated? And I'll put this out there so that we steer away from politics. What else in Jewish life is there?
Rainbow.
Say again?
Rainbow.
Rainbow, excellent. Something that you see, that there is a bracha that we are mandated to say. So one is seeing a rainbow. What else in Jewish life, if you see it?
Thunder and lightning.
Thunder and lightning, excellent. If you can see thunder, I would say two brachos.
Okay, hear it. Yeah, but you can see the lightning.
Yeah, that's why I said it. I felt comfortable because I knew what you meant. So if you see lightning or hear thunder, or if you see a rainbow, what else?
Canadian Rockies.
Ocean.
Canadian Rockies.
A fruit tree.
So if you see the ocean, there's a debate about whether it's just the Mediterranean or any ocean, because that's called Yam HaGadol. We had a big ocean. Someone said the Rockies, the Alps, a big set of mountains. If you see, somebody I think said fig tree. If you see a tree in blossom in the month of Nisan, there's Birchat HaIlanot. And guess what? About 2 months ago, in the month of Nisan, maybe it was 3 months ago now, COVID hit. No one was going out. Nobody was going in groups. And trees were blossoming. If somebody went with a camera and said, I know none of you can come out, we're all in quarantine, whatever it is, but I've got my phone, I'm going to zoom this blossoming fruit tree. Everybody can say Birchat HaIlanot now. Can you say it? Can you simulate Riyah or not? That's the question. And that's the same thing about saying a bracha on a president. Oh, okay. Time is short, so I'm not going to show you all of this, but I don't know about you. Some of you may like this. Some of you may find it beyond boring. But wildlife documentaries, when done well, I find to be outstanding. And my particular bias is the BBC has a bunch of series called Planet Earth. I don't know how many of you have seen this. They're on Netflix. They are beautifully filmed, beautifully scored with the music as well. And I was going to show you the trailer for 2 minutes, but I think I'll fall asleep if I play it all. But for the sake of the slides, I'm going to have to play a second of it. And I was going to ask you if you felt moved by it. And I guess we'll find out. I would much rather sit in my house with the music playing and the imagery and my bathroom and my kitchen and my pajamas than schlep out and sweat in the middle of a desert somewhere. But I know, not from experience because that's my inclination, but I know people who have done these things and been on safaris and been that close to animals that it is hard to describe the impact it has to see these wonders in the flesh. Anybody here been on safari? Yaakov? Okay, so we've had one person on safari and one person in the White House. We're going to have to work on some of these things. The Bronx Zoo should be opening up in a few weeks, I hope. So maybe we'll do a group trip. But there's a question about, and obviously when you're standing on safari, you don't have an orchestra in your pocket, so you don't have the emotive music, but there's a way to be moved. And there's a discussion about whether you should say a bracha. Again, we're not going to read this all in the inside, but the B'Tzelach Chochmah, Rav B'Tzalel Stern suggests that when it comes to evidence, he used exactly this distinction. He says, Makom Loma, you could say, Shelo Hikpida Torah Shiyiru Ha'edim. When it comes to witnesses and evidence, you could say the Torah doesn't care. Im Shiyiru Ha'edim Etzem Hadavar, if the witnesses actually saw it themselves, Shme'idim Alav, the Kol Sharo Woto Raya Brura Shen Listapek B'Ta'ot. If it's just about seeing it and knowing for sure and not making a mistake, it's just about knowing it. You don't have to see it. And that makes sense to me. The Gam Zechashiv Bara, even if they don't see it with their eyes, however, he says, Amnam, Kol Ze Le'inyan Edut, that's only evidence, Masha Ein Ken Le'inyan Birchat HaRiyah, but when it comes to saying a bracha on seeing something, Riyazu, Eina Kadei Levarem Etziut Hadavar. This is not about certainty. It's not like, oh, was that really a rainbow? Because if it was really a rainbow, I'll say a bracha. It's not about ascertaining facts. It's about responding with feeling. And that's what determines a bracha. So again, we see the president on our screens all day, every day. And I'm sure, I'm not going to dive into this. We all have different reactions, different feelings when we see it. But I think there would be a universal sense to seeing a president in the flesh of this is the president of the United States. However you feel about that person, I think being in the presence of that raw executive power or that celebrity has an impact on the person. People get tongue-tied. They get, what is it called when you're in front of starstruck? When you see people of that renown, and to some degree it's because it has an impact on you. If you see mountains with your eyes, he's suggesting that's very different to just evidence, which it doesn't matter if you saw it or not. And Rav Shachter actually answered this question about Birchat Ha'alanot, B'derech Zoom, said whether somebody can do Zoom with Birchat Ha'alanot, and he basically said as follows, Kasharoin be'einayim, when you see with your eyes, Mash nimtza lefanav mamash, what is in front of you physically, yesh, and this is going to be a central word, yesh hidrag shut. What is hidrag shut?
Emotion.
Emotion, sensation, feeling. When you see something with your own eyes, you have an emotive reaction. The midah mesuyemet to some degree. He says, lefamim shel simcha, lefamim shel atzavut. Sometimes it's distressing, and sometimes it's celebration. The distressing response would be you go to the kotel. I know a lot of people feel moved in a joyful way. He's suggesting you see the kotel, you feel a sense of mourning for what should be there. Masha ein ken baroa derech Zoom. And when you see it on Zoom, you don't have the same response. Even though we just saw animals flying about on the screen and some of it was beautifully filmed, you don't have the same reaction to being in nature. You can turn the screen off, walk away. You're not that moved. Again, we live in an age where so much of our emotive attention is connected through the screen. We watch movies, we hear documentaries, we watch the news. So much of what moves us is by screen. But the suggestion is that actually seeing with your own eyes is of a different order. And he suggested, actually, I don't know how to resolve this. It could be that Birchot Re'iyah need to be seen with your eyes, and it could be not. So what he says is, it's a safek, you're in doubt, so you go lenient in both directions. It says you shouldn't say a bracha if you see something on the screen, but in the same sense, if you then, for example, if one sees Yerushalayim, the Kotel, for the first time in 30 days, you should take Kriya on your shirt. If you've seen it within 30 days, you don't take Kriya. So he says, if you saw the Kotel on screen, and then next week you went to the Kotel, you would not take Kriya on either occasion. Because seeing it on the screen, I don't know if you should. And when you go to the kotel, I don't know if I should because maybe I just saw it within 30 days. So that's his view. He kind of leans on the fence on that one. Others think the Birchat Riyah really require you to see it with your eyes. Now, we'll move on to attention. Now, those of you who are in the medical profession or who have sought medical attention over the past couple months, that which was not urgent medicine, a lot was done over telemedicine. You would make calls on your phone, on your screen, on your computer, and they would speak to you that way. And there is a question in halachic life as to whether you can fulfill obligations to visit the sick through technological means. Can you simulate attention? Now, this first, we don't have to go into a lot of detail here. I just want to showcase that technology was being predicted a long time ago. This is a Bet Yitzchak who was writing in the middle 1800s. And he said, can you make a shaliach al yedei, what is this word?
Telegraph.
Excellent. Can you make a shliach through a telegraph? Can I send a text basically to appoint shliach for me? And he says, no, I don't think so. Because when you appoint a shliach, they need to see you. You need to be paying attention to them. But then he says, let's engage in a little bit of imagination. Vim yatsala poel mechunat telefat. If there's something that's a telefat or a teletaskop. What is a teletoscope? It's not a telescope. So this is a teletoscope, which is, I think, Rabbi Shlomo Brody has suggested, is a Yiddishization of the teletroscope, which in 1859 was an invention that gave images at a distance. It was in fiction, it was an idea at the time. But he said, if such a thing should ever come to be, asher yuchal lirot gam tzurat hamadaber, when you can also see the person speaking, can you imagine? Excuse me, Alpi Patrafia through the site. Say again.
Photographia.
Photographia. Thank
Photographia. Photograph.
Thank you. So it says it would make more sense to be lenient if you could see the whole person, you can pay more attention. And this is discussed in the Minchat Yitzchak Rav Yitzchak Weiss, who was dying in Manchester, then in Israel, when he talks about visiting the sick. And he says, these are the most important words we'll see here. Telephone, speaking on the telephone. This is the middle of the 20th century, 1900. Speaking on the telephone, he says, it is like you are grasping in the dark. And sometimes you have to speak to clarify. You don't know what's going on. And only once you see the person face to face, and you investigate their situation of the sick, then you understand what's going on. And his suggestion is that actually you can't fulfill the entire obligation of Bikur Cholim through Zoom, but it's better than nothing. And you should do it if that's all available. But if you have the chance to see them in person, you should see them in person for the first visit. And then once you've determined their situation, their status, their needs, you can follow up on Zoom. So I'm not going to suggest the Minchat Yitzchak should be used as a model for telemedicine, where you should say the first visit should be in person, and then follow-ups over Zoom or telehealth. But it's an interesting suggestion. And then again, he says that it's interesting. Im yitpateach, that's in the middle 1900s, if it should happen, ha-television, that the television, the Shimush Yechidim, should work as a personal means, kamo a telephone kayom, like the telephone of today, and then you can speak and talk with the person. This obviously is not about evidence. You don't need to be able to see. Technically, it's not Birchat Re'iyah. Paying attention, he suggests, can be simulated as long as you can figure out exactly the status of the person you're paying attention to. So the suggestion here is it could well be that doing a Zoom visit, and I know for many of those who had loved ones who passed away over the last few months and have sat Shiva over Zoom, it's been interesting and difficult, a challenge, a very different dynamic than an ordinary Shiva would be. The suggestion here may be that actually visiting someone over Zoom for Shiva may well be a good way of fulfilling the mitzvah, paying them attention, being there for them, giving them one-on-one time to see how they're doing and what they need. You can ask questions, you can see what they're like. You could push back and suggest that really you need to be in person to assess all of that. And he kind of, again, operates on the fence because for him, Zoom is a fiction. It's not a reality yet. So we'll move on from attention now. Now, Only a couple more minutes and then we'll wrap up. We have only 2 more sections. Anyone here seen Darren Brown on Netflix? Okay, I'm giving you some recommendations. You got Planet Earth to see, you got Darren Brown, and I'm sure you've all got Hamilton on Disney Plus that you got to see to save yourself $1,000 to go tickets, unless you already went, in which case you're going to get double your money for watching it on Disney Plus. Which again, I guess you could ask, is it the same as being in the theater? That would be a reasonable question. Birchat Riyah, you don't say bracha when you go to the theater, even if it is for something like Hamilton. But you could ask yourself, is it the same as being there in person? And I'll confess, I started watching it last night with Miriam because she would have loved to go to the theater, and we don't usually go, but it's on Disney Plus and it's sitting there, and we have to watch Frozen every week with our kids, so we may as well use it for something that we might enjoy. And she felt very moved by watching it on screen. Could be she just thought we'd never get to see it. But I enjoyed it as well. And guess what? When we finished, I didn't have to drive home. I didn't have to get in the cab. I didn't have to get on the subway. So who knows? Either way, Darren Brown's on Netflix too. And he is a fascinating and powerful presenter who has a number of shows on Netflix, which are in the middle of entertainment education. He's a psychologist by training, not a professional psychologist, but by training. And he depicts himself as what was called an illusionist. He would run shows, you can find them on YouTube, where he would essentially entertain audiences all night by reading their minds. And he would say to them, I cannot read minds. This is not magic. This is not some form of ancient practice. I am just using the psychological tools that I have refined and spent a huge amount of time studying human behavior, that I can tell what you're about to say or what you're thinking because of small giveaways in your eyelids or your lips, whatever it is. And his latest projects on Netflix have been to stress a more social point. One was about, it's called The Push, I think. And that was to show how far we would all go in terms of our moral code under peer pressure. And he essentially gets to a point where a number of people end up thinking that they're killing someone, even though they never would imagine they could do that. That's called The Push. You can watch that. And this is Sacrifice, where he gets somebody, this was again during the 2016 election when temperatures were very high in the country. Not that they've particularly cooled down, but this was at a time where he took somebody who was, I don't know if radical is the right word or extreme is the right word, but anti-immigrant to the extreme, politically, policy-wise. He took them, and by the end of the program, he has them willing to give their life, literally give their life to protect an illegal immigrant. And it's called Sacrifice, and it's a long story, the way that he shows how the mind works, how emotions work, how empathy works. But there is one scene that struck me that has been written up in the New York Times 20 years ago. There's a New York-based psychiatrist called Arthur Aaron, Jewish, I think, not that that's particularly pertinent, but he's Jewish. And he came up with this tool for empathy, where if you stare into the eyes of another person for 4 minutes at least, you start to experience radical, inexplicable emotion. And many of us never have the chance to do this. Who looks at someone in the eye for 4 minutes in a row? But he did multiple tries and trials on this, and then it was used in dating programs and all other things, where if you look for 4 minutes straight in somebody's eyes, you develop a deep bond. It was written up, I think, in the New York Times saying, you want to fall in love? Look at somebody in the eyes for 4 minutes and that'll do it. And Darren Brown in this program takes this person who is anti-immigrant, has him sit down in a room with somebody of the racial characteristics of who they were stereotyping as an immigrant, as somebody of Mexican-looking origin. And they sat and looked into each other for 4 minutes. And by the end of the 4 minutes, this anti-immigrant political activist started bawling tears. It was inexplicable. They started shaking and shuddering and crying and just looked at this person and said, can I please hug you? Please, can I just hug you? And it was the most astonishing thing to watch. Either way, there is something about human bonds that you can develop in person. And the question then becomes, when it comes to friendship or empathy or bonds, can that be simulated through the machine? And I was astonishing to discover this last week, maybe 2 weeks ago. There is a website that you can all go to, and it is called human online. And the rules of the website are there is no speaking, there is no typing, there are no messages. You put in your address or something and a time slot, and it gives you a time slot and it matches you with another human being from anywhere on earth, and you just look at each other's eyes for a number of minutes to see what happens. And I guess the question would be, what do you think is as effective? And the truth is, just this advert, just this image is astonishing to me. The eyes really make eye contact. I did not try it, but you're welcome to do it if you want to experiment. But the question would be, can you simulate friendship? And the reports from that website are that you can simulate it to some degree. But then we'll have to ask the halachic question. What does halacha demand when it comes to friendship? And this is one thing we'll explore very, very briefly that will be pertinent for many of us in the weeks, days, months ahead. B'Shu ben Levi. B'Shu ben Levi says, if there's a friend of yours and you haven't seen them for 30 days, what do you do when you see them? Omer, you say, Baruch Shechiyanu v'kimanu v'glanu zman hazeh. You say the bracha of Shechiyanu. If it's been 30 days and you have a close friend and you haven't seen them, you say the bracha. Now, we may instinctively be thinking, I got a lot of friends in Israel, in England, in California. I've got lots of friends. I've got 2,000 Facebook friends. I haven't seen them all within 30 days. Presumably, this is talking about a close friendship in which you are regular contact. And then you don't see them for 30 days. You say Shechiyanu. And after 12 months, you say Baruch Mechayim Mesim. Now, a lot of people will say that without the Shem or Malchus. They won't say bracha. They'll see someone after a long time and say, Baruch Mechayim Mesim. But there is a halachic principle. If you have a close friend and you haven't seen them for 30 days, you say Shechiyanu. Now, I ask you to think to yourselves, sitting in your homes now, how many of your friends who you usually see every week have you not seen for 30 days? And I imagine there's a long list of people. But I imagine you have seen them on Zoom. So the question then becomes, if I see them in person for the first time in 30 days, has our friendship been simulated on Zoom to the extent that I don't say a bracha? Or halachically, should I be saying a bracha? This was addressed a couple hundred years ago, obviously not about Zoom. But what about she'elah? The question was, if you saw a friend and then you left for a little bit, you didn't see them. But during 30 days, you got a letter from them. So you were in contact, you just didn't see them. Do you say Shechiyanu? And the answer he gave was, Shechiyanu shehu al re'iyat hapanim ye'amer. You should say Shechiyanu, because Shechiyanu isn't just that you know they're alive. Mechayim Mesim, he says, if you got a letter, you don't say that, because you know they're alive. Shechiyanu is not about knowing they're alive. Shechiyanu is, I've seen your face in the last 30 days. That gives me life. That gives me vitality. That inspires me that I've had your presence. And if you haven't had that for 30 days, you say the bracha. And a letter doesn't intervene. And there are Shulchan, a more recent figure, echoes the same idea. He says, when you see face to face, there's a bracha. So the Yechavadat, which is Ravad Yosef, didn't address Zoom. He did address telephone. What happened if I had a phone call with them yesterday? I haven't seen them for 2 months. We had a phone call yesterday to arrange where we'd meet for coffee. We then got together for coffee. I spoke to them on the phone yesterday. I heard their voice yesterday. Do I say Shechiyanu? And he says, yes. She'ena doma shmi'a l'riyah. Hearing their voice is not like seeing a face. She'pa'alut v'dragshut, that word again. Because the emotive response, hanafshit, the spiritual reaction, to panim al panim beyeter shed veyeter oz is far more profound, far more powerful, far more poignant in person than just hearing a voice. Seeing a face impacts you in a way you can't imagine. And I hadn't thought about this till this moment, but I'm sure we all have an experience to draw. And I remember the last time I looked at my grandfather in the face. I got married 8 years ago in America. We went to London for some Sheva Brachot. My grandfather was unwell. He was old. He wasn't really in decline, but when you live far away, and I'm sure many of you have family members in other countries, how often do you go? Once a year, maybe twice a year if you're lucky. So I remember with ever Sheva Brachot, I knew I'm coming back to America. It's the summer. I don't know when I'm going back to England, maybe December. And I remember looking at my grandfather and in my head, not verbalizing, but thinking, is this going to be the last time that we see each other? And I remember him looking at me, and I think we had that silent recognition that it's quite possible. And obviously we're not going to say that, but it's quite moving. And of course we spoke on Skype 2 days later, and we spoke on the phone 4 days later, but knowing that the person's presence has a spiritual, emotive impact is precisely what Yechavedat suggests. And Rav Avram Stav, who's a young man, the son of Rav Stav from Sohar, suggests Barur. He says it's clear, L'maaseh, in practice, Shemafagesh virtually, that a virtual meeting, einenu poter otanu milavarach al mefagesh mamashi, should not poter us, should not exempt us from saying a bracha on seeing someone in the flesh. And he says, and the proof is, no one says if you saw Yerushalayim on the screen, or you saw the president on a screen, you wouldn't say bracha when you see them. Now, we said Rav Shechter entertained that possibility, but most people don't take that view. And it now sounds reasonable to suggest that really, if you haven't seen someone for 30 days, even if you've been on Zoom, we should be saying a bracha of Shechiyanu when we see them. And I said Shechiyanu when we were in shul for the first time on Shabbat 2 weeks ago. I said it from the pulpit, and I had that in mind, but Shechiyanu has got its own mechanics. But I should say there were also people in the room I'd not seen for 30 days, people who I'd see every week for the last 9 months. And I think there are a few times in life, and I said this in shul at the time, there are a few times in life where you get to say Shechiyanu, and you literally are grateful that both parties are living. Not just, you say Shechiyanu every Yom Tov, oh, wonderful, we're here, we're going to have a new fruit to have in mind, just in case I should say this, because I didn't have any expectation that I wouldn't be here. But of course, under these circumstances, there's an expectation rampant that people won't be here. And seeing somebody in the flesh and saying Shechiyanu, I think, is a perfectly apt, meaningful, and poignant, precisely as we have expressed it. Now, I know we've gone over time, and I said we wouldn't, so you'll have to forgive me for that. I apologize. There's one more thing that I'm not going to read, but I'll go through very quickly. There's a question of prayer, about whether you can simulate prayer. We're not going to read it all through. Can you hear shofar through a microphone or over the internet? Now, of course, shofar has to be in Rosh Hashanah, and we asked that question about electricity and Yom Tov a few times ago. But put that aside, can you hear Megillah through the internet? Can you hear Megillah through a microphone? These are all, can you simulate the auditory reception of prayer? That's been discussed, and there are three views. The Minchat Shlomo says you can't. The Minchat Elazar says Megillah you can, shofar you can't, and Rav Moshe Feinstein suggests you can simulate prayer. You can hear the Megillah. You can be Yotzei being with a minyan. You can't reverse simulate it, we'll get to in a minute, but if you're at home right now and you're tuning in to our Mincha minyan every night, or Shacharis minyan in the morning, and you hear Kaddish and you hear Kedusha, you being Yotzei your mitzvah of saying Kedusha, of listening Kaddish, and saying Yehi Shmei Rabbah, the Igros Moshe says you can simulate that. And that's the view a lot of people have taken under these circumstances. We're not going to be able to spend much more time on that, though of course there are implications. There's Rav Moshe has a little bit of complications back and forth. We'll leave that for another time. And of course, this is somebody, a picture, probably the most recent picture I have on any of the slides, of somebody davening at home attached to a Zoom minyan. And the question was, can you have people in their own homes make a minyan by being on Zoom? And I think, having explored what we've explored, there is something now quite profound being said in the conclusion that you can't form a minyan over Zoom. You can establish evidence over Zoom, we've suggested. We've suggested that you can publicize things over Zoom, but I think a minyan, what we are determining through these sources, we've got all the sources here on the page, we're not going to read inside, who say you cannot have a minyan over Zoom. I mean, these are the words of Rav Asher Weiss. He says, if you daven all together at the same time with the Shlich Tzibur, finishing together, kach na'eh v'kach ya'eh, it's a wonderful thing, don't get me wrong, and that's what we did when the shul was closed. We had a nightly mariv where we got together, we didn't say Kaddish, we didn't say Kedusha, we didn't say anything that needs a minyan, but we said things together, and that was a wonderful thing to do, to hold us together. But he says, Pashut u'bara, he says, it's obvious, she'enu mitzdarfen, that you can't combine to make a minyan. And why is that? And the suggestion based on what we've been doing so far is that being in a minyan is not just about establishing the fact there are 10 people doing this at the same time. And it's not just about publicizing our prayer. What is minyan about? It's about forging bonds, being together, making a congregation, which is why, of course, shul being shut was so hard and technology didn't replace it. And for those who are still unable to come to shul, I feel the pain and I understand the loss, because it's not, you can't compensate over Zoom. Of course, we can compensate to a degree, we can fill a void, we can keep us afloat. But Zoom is not a sustained way to build relationships or friendships, and that's why we're so desperate for a vaccine or a cure and for this crisis to come to an end so that we can be together in a room and maintain those bonds in a real human way. Of course, having said that, kach na'er v'kach ya'er, I don't want to finish this section on a down. Zoom has been a tremendous tool. We have been able, and again, in a crisis like this, just to have evidence of life, just to establish the fact that we're all still here is a magnificent accomplishment. Can you imagine if 200 years ago they had the science to know that everybody should stay in their house and no technology to communicate? I can't imagine the horrors of that. So this is a tremendous blessing that we have the capacity to publicize each other's needs, to publicize communal events, to establish the fact that we're all engaged and we're all still here and we're all still friends and we're all still committed. But of course, that in no way means that following this crisis, let's sell the building, split the proceeds, give it all to the rabbi, and then just do everything on Zoom from now on. That's not the conclusion we should draw. The conclusion we should draw is keep this building alive, come back, be in each other's presence, forge bonds, look each other in the eye. Now, this is where I had planned to end until this morning, and we'll basically end here too. But I should note, on the agenda, I could end our exploration of electricity in Jewish life right now, but I would have to fill this in the next few years, because there are inventions, discoveries taking place as we speak that are looking to simulate other things. And I should say everything that we have spoken about simulating so far is to do with only 2 of the senses. Which 2?
Hearing and hearing.
Hearing and seeing. What are the other senses for the record?
Smelling and tasting.
Smell, taste, touch.
Smell, taste, and touch. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume you can't really simulate that. But then again, this morning I discovered the world is not a reasonable place. Oh, that was a different question. We'll come to that, I guess, another time. There are companies, vapor technologies, I think is one technology, where you can now simulate taste. You buy this, it's called an O-phone. You have it in your house. You've got an app where you can select smells, and Vapor Communications, that's what it's called. They launched is Cyrano, which is a Spanish figure who is known to have a very large nose. So they called their machine Cyrano, a digital scent speaker and mood modification platform. So you have this thing in your house, you decide what scent you want, and you have these little filters you install in them, and it produces the scent you want. And what's most amazing about this is this O-phone. You can put it in a room with you. You push down on the thing on the side, and it inhales the air, detects the scent, and it sends a scent message to your friend who's got one of those emitters in their house, and you can emit whatever scent you send them, which of course has, I'm sure, horrific uses. They interviewed somebody who said, yeah, next time I come out of the gym, I'll give a whiff to my wife to show how productive I've been. But of course, this could be useful if you want to purchase perfume and you're in a store and you say, I want to get a perfume for my friend, and see if you like it, and you inhale it, you send the message, and it'll emit it in their house, and they get to smell the now synthetic artificial smell. So the question then would be, comes to Havdalah, I have this synthetic artificial scent, can I say Basamim on that? I'm trying to think when else in Jewish life there's a response to a smell, and there are some occasions it's prohibited to smell chametz on Pesach. You can't have hana from chametz. What if I set my ophone to emit the smell of freshly baked bread, and I enjoy it. And I just sit there sniffing it in the middle of Pesach Chol Hamoed. Can I do that? I don't know the answer to that. And we could all harbor a guess. But again, this was just this morning when it suddenly struck me. There are things that we could simulate beyond sight and sound. And I thought probably nobody has, but I Googled it. And unfortunately, there went my morning because people have. And there is this company now, Sensory Cloud, designing solutions for respiratory biology and olfaction. And I spent about 45 minutes sifting through different companies. There was one company that was rated the 50 worst companies in the last 10 years called I Smell. That was, and you can imagine from the title, they didn't go, it was based on the iPhone, the I Smell, where you could send a monitor out into the desert to smell things, and it would have been useful if you wanted to trace, for example, carbon monoxide poisoning. You could send it into a home. Well, that's scentless, I guess, but something with a scent, send it off and it could smell and detect it and send back what it smelled. Either way, there are questions on the halakhic horizon when it comes to smell. What were the other senses?
Touch and taste.
Taste and touch.
Taste and touch. How do you simulate taste? You can't possibly have that. Oh, okay. Before we get to that, I didn't have time to rehearse the slides. It is discussed on Shabbos when it comes to Havdalah. Can you make a bracha on a synthetic smell? You get an air freshener out the bathroom. You don't have any cloves. You don't have any cinnamon. You don't have any. What are you meant to do? Can you take a synthetic air freshener out and say a bracha? And there's a machloket. There's one view that says no, because it's synthetic. And the view that Pnei Halacha takes is that actually it doesn't matter if it's synthetic. You are smelling something real. And that chemistry that generates that aroma deserves a bracha. So that's his view. So if you're in a tight spot on a Motzei Shabbos, you don't have any cloves, you don't have any cinnamon, get the air freshener out and you'll be okay. Now, oh, I forgot about this. I said there was a lot of time on this. There is a company that is generating a contraption that does not generate synthetic smell by combining different filters of different odors, but has an iode that goes into your nose and touches the nerve with an electric generated impulse that communicates scent to your brain. So there's no chemistry of the smell, but your brain interprets that electric impulse as a smell. And I guess the question would be, let's say we say you shouldn't use the ophone to sniff chametz the whole week of Pesach, but I've got this digital smell interface and I put the electrode in my nose. You've got to be desperate to smell bread to do this. But you put it in your nose and you set it on pizza and you sit there for 7 days of Chol Hamoed sniffing bread through your nose without any chemistry going on that's olfactory. Would that be prohibited? Who knows? They'll come to that. The next, taste. We're going to go through this rapidly. Can you simulate taste? Of course you can't simulate taste. That's what you would think, but you have not come across the Norimaki synthesizer. I can't believe you haven't come across that, where taste display using ion electrophoresis in 5 gels, and you can see the date here. This is April 2020. This is only a couple months old, where there is a group here, we're not going to read it all, who suggests that they now have a way. Where does it say? We present. Where does it say? Who has it? Either way, they now have a contraption. This is the contraption that has 5 congealed gels, which have the 5 central tastes that we can have on our tongue. And through electric diodes, the gels shift in their emphasis, and you can put it on your tongue, and you can program the taste of sushi, and you can get a pretty close taste of sushi on your tongue if you lick those gels because of the electric impulse that moves it around. So I guess the question there would be, these are just gels. Assuming they're kosher, or maybe not even assuming they're kosher. What if I set it to pork and I wanted to sit there licking the taste of pork all day? Or during Pesach, I wanted to lick chametz all day. Say again? Or I see. If I'm sitting on a fast day, Thursday, we've got Tanis coming up, can I sit there licking tastes of things that I love all day long? I imagine after a while we'd have the same response of Bnei Israel to the man. It can taste like whatever, but it's not food. Give me food. But the question would still pertain. There are others. There's an app here where you can buy this. It's called the Voktail because it's a virtual cocktail. You just put water in, but as you drink it, there is an aroma that is emitted from this tube, and this electrode goes on your tongue. And as you drink it, you can program whatever flavor you like. You can mix your own drink while you're just drinking water, but the diode goes on your tongue. It puts an aroma out, and you fool yourself into drinking things. I don't know what the application or likely of that might be, but we could think about it. Let's say you've got no grape juice in the house, and you've got a choice between orange juice for Havdalah or the Voktail with water that's going to taste like wine. What should you do? Chama Medina with the orange juice, or should you fake yourself out and imagine you're drinking wine and taste wine and smell wine? Who knows? But you can ask the poskim when that comes. Either way, there's something going on with smell. Now, the last sentence, how do you simulate touch? Can't be done. That's what you would think. Until January 9th of 2019, when they have this wireless haptic interface. Why you don't know about haptic interfaces, I can't begin to explain. But this is, as you can see from the names here, I think an invention not of scientists in the United States, although John Rogers seemed to have gotten on the act somehow. But there is a haptic interface here. So this is where it says we present. Here they acknowledge traditional technologies for virtual reality and augmented reality create human experiences through visual and auditory stimuli that replicate sensations associated with the visual world. But here we present a wireless, battery-free platform of electronic systems and haptic, they know we don't know what that is touch-based, interfaces capable of softly laminating onto the curved surfaces of the skin to communicate information via spatio-temporally programmable patterns of localized mechanical vibrations. Now, I wouldn't even torture you in a drasha with language like that. But that is essentially saying that they have now got this contraption that can simulate touch. How does it simulate touch? Here's one example of an application. When you play video games, you put this on your back, you put that on your front, those on your arms, that on your side. Then you play a wrestling game, and every time they hit you, you get a punch to the chest, or you get slammed on the arm, depending on where they're hitting you. So there are entertainment applications for this, which I imagine is probably the most lucrative outlet. But what we'll see is there are medical situations. If someone's an amputee and they have a prosthetic limb, how do you know if you've lifted something up? So you put this platform, this haptic interface around the upper arm where there are nerve receptors, and you program it so the sensors here pick up touch, and it simulates the touch on your upper arm. So if you're left in a prosthetic situation and you need to pick up a coffee or a glass, and this is something that robots cannot perfect, how to pick up a glass so that it doesn't fall or doesn't crash. The ability that we all, thank God, most of the time have the capacity to do without thinking. Pick up a crystal glass without it shattering or dropping is something that artificial machines can't replicate very easily. But here with this touch simulation, they can lift things up very gently and they feel the sensation on their arm. Now, the last application that they had as an option, I think would be particularly meaningful and probably the most apt in terms of halakha, which is the simulation of touch over video call. Here you've got a grandparent and a grandchild sitting there, and the grandchild touches the screen. And if you've got one of these wrapped around your arms, you can feel the touch of a hand. And because of the programming, you don't just get squeezed like they do with the blood pressure. You feel different fingers. You feel different pressures. You feel like a hand is touching you. And I imagine for a lot of people who are stuck in isolation, unable to see family or grandkids, having put one of those on might feel artificial, but to feel somebody tap you on the shoulder or give you a hug or squeeze your arm, I can imagine would revolutionize what virtual conversations are like. And of course, there would be halachic implications to this. When it comes to shomanigia, I imagine that comes first thing to mind. Let's say you put these mats on your arms. Can you start holding hands with somebody you're not meant to be holding hands with yet? I'm not really touching them. And I assume we all have a gut instinct to what rabbis are going to say about that, but it's a halachic question. I try to think of other cases in Jewish life where there's an obligation to touch something or there's a prohibition on touching something. I guess one application might be there are views that one shouldn't touch the kotel because it's essentially me'ilah, it's sacred, it's consecrated, and you shouldn't benefit from it, and leaning on it is supporting your way. You know, general evidence, people lean on it. But there are views that say you shouldn't. So let's say there was the the group who make all the menorahs and all the kalim say, what we're going to do, we'll put one of these sensors on the kotel, and you can just go onto the virtual website and feel, and you will feel the crevices of the wall. Is that me'il or not? I guess we could ask all these questions. And now that we've been through, those were the supplementary things I wanted to add. I'm sorry you went over time again. I promise you we won't go over time next week because this is the last time. But I think to summarize what we've seen over the last 5 sessions is how pervasive electricity has changed human life from every sphere of human experience. But I think what we've seen is that's something I think self-evident to us, even if subliminal. But something that we've seen through these explorations is not just how pervasive electricity is, but how pervasive halakha is. That we, as electricity has swept through human experience, halakha has something to say about everything in every instance, from how we bake our bread and write our books and light our homes and form our bonds and see the world. And I think that testifies to how rich halakha is, how rich Jewish life is. And when we see we are grasping at straws for examples from secular law or from other faiths as to how they deal with these questions, and a lot of time, they don't. It's just life changes and you move on. But what halakha does for us, it forces us to think about the impact of touch and sight and smell and hearing. And it makes us think about what it means to be in each other's presence and what it means to rest on Shabbat and what it means to invest things with sanctity, what it means to remember the dead, what it means to light up a shul. It makes us ask these questions in a way that I hope has shown us that actually when we talk about electricity in Jewish life, the real electricity in Jewish life is Jewish law and Jewish thought and the Torah. And as we pivot now into the 3 weeks and the almost bottomless pit of Jewish persecutions and tragedies, I think we can take some solace, some comfort in that what has got us as a people through those crises and will get us through every crisis is the Torah. And that is not just a mystical observation about the powers of Torah, but the fact that it has an answer and a question about every facet of human experience gives us a purpose and a drive and a perspective and an answer to these questions in a way that lets us live vital lives. And we've seen over the last few months, people who don't have religious connections have felt lost to a far higher proportion than those who've been able to tune into religious services or classes or events, because these questions, even when they don't come with answers, they give us purpose, they give us direction, and they give us drive. I want to thank you all for tuning in. I want to apologize to all of you for going over time again. As I said, I won't do it next week. Next week, the plan is, as it stands, for Miriam, that's Miriam Lerner, will be giving a share to do with the Haftorahs in the 3 weeks. We haven't advertised that yet, but I just have, and we will get that out there. But I will give you a break from my dulcet tones at 10:30 in the evening. I am available